Okay. All right. So I'm Denise Diskin. I'm the Executive Director of Q Law Foundation of Washington. I'm excited to see you all here. Really, really grateful that you all came to join us today. Just a little bit about Q Law Foundation of Washington, if you don't know us already, since there are some folks whose names I don't know yet. Q Law Foundation of Washington provides free legal services for LGBTQ communities throughout the state of Washington. Those services include an LGBTQ legal clinic that happens twice a month that is available statewide for LGBTQ communities. And it also includes a clinic that offers second parent adoption services, as well as a wide range of community legal resources that are developed by our amazing team made up of Al Littlejohn, Jesse Guecha, and Kenji Fujinaka, who is going to be presenting for us today. So Kenji is our fantastic intern through the University of Washington's UCBI, which is a program, which is a community-based internship program. And so Kenji has been with us since January, lending their expertise in all kinds of things that, frankly, we really, really needed, including social media support, writing skills, graphic design, and as you will learn shortly in just a couple of minutes, user-centered design for development of legal resources. So with all of that, I will go ahead and hand it over to you, Kenji.
Nice. All right. Let me get this whole screen sharing business going. All right. I think it's good, maybe. Anyway, yes, hello. My name is Kenji. My pronouns are they, them, and thank you for taking the time to be here and listen to me talk for the next 20 minutes. Yes, as Denise mentioned, I am QLaw's Community Legal Resources intern, and I'm currently a third-year undergrad at UW studying human-centered design and engineering and gender, women, and sexuality studies. And today I will be talking about user/human-centered design and why it's important for the work that we're doing. So today I'll basically just talk about what is human-centered design and / user-centered design. I'll probably just abbreviate it as such from here on out. And so I'll be talking about how I learned it in the corporate context, which is, how the education system fed it to me, my gripes with the corporate model, and then just some guiding thoughts and disclaimers as we approach this work. And then I'll talk about the perks of these methodologies, how we might apply it to our work, and then I'll explain a bit of application using some design standards that I've come to learn. So yes, what is human-centered design / user-centered design? To be honest, I claim to study this, but do I actually know what it is? It's debatable, but I think these diagrams are pretty, and there are a million of them out there if you Google the user-centered design process. So in the corporate context, this is kind of what the process looks like. It's identify the problem, you user research, identify possible solutions, prototype, test with potential users, revise, repeat, etc. until your product launches. And then you can repeat those steps any number of times. I feel like design is never really over, there's not really an end, which for me as someone who grew up in STEM is very weird. Design, yeah, is super open-ended and is never over, and yeah, I don't know. Anyway, these flowcharts I think are very appeals to our very human tendencies to want to atomize and categorize everything into distinct steps. But I think, as I said, there's no really defined start and end, so I'm not entirely sure that it's as clear cut as we might think. So some parts that I don't totally agree with are these reasons listed. So first, I have a hard time reconciling that the standards that design thinks are like good or useful or clean, um, which are all kind of standards developed by like these old white European guys, and we're still taught their standards today. And I'm usually left wishing that there was more diversity in my design training. Um, and then in corporate contexts, I hear that sometimes user research is kind of glossed over because it's considered a waste of time. Because, if you're not developing the product, then you can't make any money. But arguably, user research is the most important part. It's also my favorite part of the design process. So, yeah, it makes me kind of sad sometimes that to know that companies aren't really giving it the time that it deserves. I'll talk about this more later, but design saviorism, designing for a problem that doesn't exist, or designing for the wrong problem because it's not actually what a community wants or needs. And then finally, companies taking advantage of their consumers by creating products that lead to unhealthy behavior. So, social media, I think, is a great example. We're psychologically primed to be obsessed with likes and follows and the numbers and that dopamine hit. So, and the more time we spend on their apps, the more money places make. So, you know, predatory capitalism. So, an example of that is there's this cute graphic that I found on Instagram. But basically, that shop tab at the bottom in the red circle used to be where users saw their notifications, so likes and comments and follow notifications. And that tab has been there since Instagram was created, basically. And I've been on Instagram since it was made, which is like 10 years. And that's wild. But only in the last year, so they changed that tab to be a shop tab. And Instagram didn't even have an ability to buy products on their platform before. And I still find myself clicking that tab out of habit sometimes. And I use Instagram daily. So I think this is just an example of taking advantage of our mental models and psychological tendencies, because this was certainly an intentional design choice. Like, that was not an accident. So, I guess just some guiding thoughts or disclaimers. Uh, Obviously, I'm not a fan of these corporatized models, but I will admit that they do work, at least to a fault. I think I wouldn't have been taught the models if, they hadn't been successful in professional context. I think also it's important to highlight that we don't really notice good design choices. I think they're meant to feel normal and natural, and we only really see the cracks in the foundation if something stops working or we struggle with um, getting the product to do what we want it to do. And so, yeah, it's kind of like you only really notice the design when it breaks because then it's not like great design. And then, as I mentioned earlier, design saviorism, very real. Um, yeah, the whole trying to create and solve a problem that doesn't exist just for the sake of it. Like mutual aid efforts and communities have already had ways of surviving and helping each other out even before any kind of outside help comes along. And so, yeah, I think a way to combat this kind of mindset is participatory design, which I'll also touch on later. And I think I can send out these slides when this is over. Um, but there's this article slash website that I found, and I think it's helpful. It's called How to Think Differently About Doing Good as a Creative Person. Um, yeah, just some interesting like guiding thoughts and questions that they have. So I'm going to stop harping on this process and we'll talk about the upsides. So the upsides is that ideally you'll be working with the people who ultimately would use your resources or information or whatever you're providing to community. And then in turn, the hope is that community will get the most out of your resource as possible since you're catering it for them. Um, and so then it will, by nature, go farther. Um, Also, I think this kind of shift in perspective is helpful and can make you more cognizant for future projects because at the end of the day, this is a skill that you learn um, 3 years ago or whatever. When I started going to UW, I had no idea what any of this stuff was or that this was even a field. And so, yeah, I definitely am not an expert on this at all, but I think it's just something that comes with practice, like any other skill. And so, how we might apply this to our work, I think the big guiding central questions are always who are we designing for, and can they come away with what they need quickly and easily. I think if you take nothing else away from this presentation, like this is the one bit of information to remember. And next I'll be talking about a couple like more general ways to tangibly connect this to our work. So the first is participatory design, which I mentioned a couple times earlier as a tactic to combat design saviorism. Um, it's basically where you work directly alongside the communities that you're designing like with. It's not exactly that you're like this overarching entity like coming in to like solve a problem or like save a community. It's and then you can work with them and get feedback in real time, and they can create like co-create these things with you. Of course, I know that there are feasibility constraints a lot of the time, and we have to just do the best that we can given the time that we have. Um, but I think it helps shift perspective from like the deficit focused mindset of just solving a problem to asking questions of how to enhance or improve the experience of a community that already has their own resources and assets, which is what the asset focused mindset I think hopes to do. And then another application of this perspective applies to designing visual materials, which is uh, basically what I spent the majority of my time at QLaw doing, whether that was social media posts or um, like designing like longer informational materials. Something important is that it's not just about the content in the resource. Like, yes, that information is important, but it's also how the content is presented on the page and as well as on the platform it's published on. Because if you can't even get people to look at your content or read it or spend the time to look at it for more than 5 seconds, then the information will never reach them. For example, certain social media platforms allow you to click links that you put in the captions, like Facebook and Twitter let you do that, but Instagram doesn't. So there's no point, for example, putting a super long link into an Instagram caption because no one's gonna um, take the time to like type that into their browser. And I think care for even small things like that show a deeper level of the knowledge of the means of communication as well, like in addition to the content and information you're trying to deliver. Um, I think we need a good balance of both because the content um, wouldn't or doesn't go as far as it could because we're not being cognizant of the means of communication. And then, so as a proof of concept, I'll just introduce a couple of Nielsen's heuristics for effective user interface design, what I believe they're called. His standards are about designing for digital interfaces, but there are definitely transferable principles that apply outside of just digital interface design. According to a quick Google search I did for this presentation, a heuristic is a problem-solving approach that enables self-discovery. that might not get people to the solution right away or get them to the precisely correct solution, but it's um, supposed to be like a self-discovered, good enough approximation for someone. I should also preface that there are tons of other heuristic systems. Um, like you could find more at the link there. Um, but I would say that this is probably the most well-known set of heuristics and the ones that are most widely used. Um, yeah, and you can probably see some more examples at that link there. So this is the list of all 10. Obviously, I'm not going to go through all 10 in detail for the sake of time, but this is the whole list if you want to see it. I'll be going over the highlighted heuristics more in depth and talk more about how you might be able to practically apply it to the work that we do. So the first is visibility of system status. In the digital world, it manifests itself in things like loading bars, hourglasses, or like those buffering wheels you get when you load YouTube videos. Oh, sorry. In the real world, I would say that um, in the real world, I would say that it's mostly about keeping community in the loop about what you're working on, offering reasonable timelines, timely updates, so we're not out here leaving people in the dark because I don't know, no one likes that. The next is a match between the system and the real world. So basically, it's just making sure that your audience can follow along with the information that you're providing them. I think especially as legal professionals, I would recommend getting a non-lawyer to read through your materials. We have law student interns at Q Law, and sometimes their condensed or distilled terms are still not totally understood by me, someone who is not familiar with the legal system at all and does not intend to go to law school. So like, I'm not really into law at all. So I think it's important for the information, especially for us, to provide that it be digestible to our intended audience, and also just making sure to ask community for feedback or have someone from your intended community like take a look at your resources, and yeah, offer feedback or yeah, just have them look it over for because you never know when you, especially when you're developing a resource for a really long time, and your brain just kind of gets used to looking at it all day every day. So it's always nice to have fresh eyes. So next is consistency of standards. Uh, the most important part of this, I think, is to not break mental models, regardless of whether we're aware of them or not. Um, all of us have mental models about how certain things should look. For example, on websites, we have an idea that information can be found with like a navigation bar on the top, or that social media and contact info can be found at the bottom of the page, things like that. The point is, like I said earlier, once these models are broken is when we notice them most, when items are not in the places that we expect, when interactions are not in the order that we think that they should be. Anyway, there are people out there whose entire career revolves around this stuff, and consultancy work definitely exists in this realm if you really want to get into it. Yeah, there are certainly many experts out there. And I think this can apply to branding as well. Obviously, it sounds weird to brand a nonprofit, but in the capitalist neoliberal wasteland that we're currently living in, um, people do develop associations to patterns and maintaining visual consistency across resources or materials. Um, I think keeping that in mind can definitely help with recognition and helping people identify your resources out of a crowd. And that is the end of the content. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing I have left is this kind of like example or like walkthrough kind of thing. Um, and this is a post from the depths of the Q Law Instagram. I just like scrolled to the bottom, like picked something. Um, I think this post has a mix of strengths and weaknesses, and I'd be curious to hear what y'all notice or see about this post. Either like as a user, like someone who might just like see this post out in the wild, or as someone who, now that you've listened to this presentation, um, like might connect some of the principles that I brought up to thinking about this post. So if anyone has ideas about uh, strong points, weak points, places that this could improve, or even uh, ideas about how this post from start to finish, from like ideation to publication, like could have come about, or the kinds of thoughts that could have gone to the process. Um, so you can either speak up or put it in chat, whatever works.
Uh, this is this is David Hinken. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me okay? So I'm an attorney with a nonprofit in Whatcom County. I don't have any instinct for graphic design, but I guess what strikes me about this is that the message, until there is dignity and respect for us all, just those words could be taken as several different tones, several different possibilities. But I like the upbeat and optimistic mood set by the stars and the expressions on people's faces. I think that it's almost subconscious, but it sets a tone, a great tone that hopefully was intended for that message.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's not something I explicitly brought up here, but color and graphics are very persuasive. Yeah, we have those like psychological associations with color. You could get into a whole thing with color theory, and stuff like that. But yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. Um, Someone in the chat says, I think it's platform limitation, but you mentioned mental models and the lack of clickable link in the text drives me nuts. Yes, I will say that, yes, that is a platform limitation with Instagram. Um, yeah, I think the best most organizations can do is mitigate that by having a link tree in their bio, where it's just a thing you click links and you click one link and it brings you to a bunch of other links. Um, yeah, I also do wish that Instagram had clickable links because Facebook owns them, and Facebook, you can click links in posts. So, don't know why they don't do that.
For me, there's also like, it's hard for my eyes, like with the contrast. Like I want to kind of look at the detail of the people because it's like somewhat, masked, but not that much. And then the contrast with the words isn't quite as much as I think my eyes would ideally like. The contrast between the color and the thickness, but
Yeah, for sure. It's like, yeah, that also gets into the more like visual design aspect. But yes, I have learned in my classes that white text on dark backgrounds is kind of hard on the eyes. And yeah, it's hard to say. I feel like it's hard to say, like how we're supposed to learn all these like visual design principles because uh, we kind of take them for granted, and if you don't know what you're looking for, it's a little rough. But going back to chat, maybe have year in review on the graphic with an overview. I wouldn't be inclined to go farther to look for info on the website. The language on the graphics has me asking until then, what? Yes. Yeah, that is also something that I noticed when I was looking at this, that the content of the graphic itself like doesn't necessarily like beg the user to read the caption or to like that there is not really a call to action. Like I personally, I think it could be more persuasive or informative. Um, yeah, even just like like you said, Al, the adding like a year in review or some kind of additional information. Um, yeah.
So I have a question about the lack of links in Instagram. Um, and one thing I've seen on Instagram is that some accounts use a link tree, which is you go to the link in the bio and it takes you to sort of boxes where there's a verbal or a word description, written description of the links. And then other accounts um, have a different version where it takes you to something that like a series of photos, and if you click on the photo, and it's usually the same photo as the post itself, and if you click on the photo it takes you to the link. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about the difference between those two, you know, in terms of what's most likely to make it easy for people to find the link that they're looking for.
Mm. Yeah. I think yeah, that's actually pretty interesting because I think I have the most experience with the former. I feel like the latter I associate with um, like magazines or like publications that have their own social media, um, whose like links do really I feel like rely on their visual content because usually the social media is like redirecting them to go to like read an article on their website or something. But yeah, I don't know. I guess that is an interesting approach, and then it has me wondering like, does matching that visual aspect to the post like help users see like, oh, this is the post I just saw, and so then I'm going to go to this link, and I don't have to remember like what exactly it was called or what it was about. Like I can just click the picture that I just saw. Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't really have any like strong feelings or preferences, maybe just because of my own familiarity with both, or varying levels of familiarity with both. But yeah, I think that's certainly an interesting, I don't know, method or like form of presenting information.
So I have another question, and then I promise I will stop asking questions and let other folks ask questions. One question I have is about kind of what Al asked about having the contents of the year in review on the graphic itself, which I think is a really good idea, mental note for our next year end review. But I'm wondering, you know, sometimes a graphic like this is meant to kind of convey a thematic approach, or I guess more like to evoke feelings about a particular organization or a particular image as opposed to convey information. And I'm wondering what you think about the effectiveness of that, particularly in the fundraising world, right? Like you use numbers, but you also evoke feelings. And I will just confess, I designed the graphic. And so what I was going for was evoking feelings about the organization, and wasn't thinking about conveying information, although I probably should have been. And so I'm wondering if there's methodologies for that, um, that's more like I'm wondering if there's methodologies for that or pluses and minuses to that approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think part of it too is also the fact that this is on Instagram, and so if someone looks at your page, um, all they see is these like thumbnails of these pictures, right? There's no like information being conveyed unless you actually take the time to like click into them. And I think this goes back to my point about uh, the kind of intimate knowledge you have to have about the means of communication or whatever platform that you're using. Um, because I think, yeah, I do agree that there's certainly that there needs to be a balance between, yeah, evoking feeling because, you know, emotion is what gets people to open their wallets. Um, and yeah, but at the same time, yeah, if you can't get people to click on it in the first place, um, yeah, I don't know, that tension, I guess, is certainly interesting. And yeah, I don't know, I think even just putting like little white text underneath or something, it's like Q Law's year in review or something, would offer like slightly more context in that kind of small way without maybe compromising the like emotional appeal of graphic itself.
Yeah,
Yes,
that makes a lot
Al.
of yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think also there's what, and this is kind of goes back to what do we notice about this post as a user, is that what that leads me to is that there's a disconnect between the message of the image and the message of the text, right? The message of the text is we have information for you. The message of the image is, you know, happy end of year from, you know, it's got kind of the holiday theme with the stars and the sparkles and like we're a team, we do these things, we're happy people hanging out, right? Like so the image is about the emotion, evoking the emotion. So maybe it would have been better to match it with text that was more just like, you know, Happy New Year from Q Law Foundation.
Yeah. I think there's a whole myriad of ways you could go about it. I think it depends on your personal preference and kind of style of the way you want to present information. But um, yeah, comments in the chat about um, yes, Instagram. Sometimes, yeah, the picture itself has to be interesting. But yeah, statistics are also, I think there's also the idea that information doesn't have to be uninteresting, if that makes sense. There are certainly many ways of data visualization and presenting information in visually interesting ways. Um, it's sometimes hard to come by, and honestly, I struggle with this myself of just not making the graphic like a wall of text, because there's so much to talk about usually. But um, yeah, I just want to put it out there that there are certainly ways to balance both and offer information in visually interesting ways. Um, I don't know if I can come up with examples off the top of my head, but um, yeah, I guess also for this post, I was thinking about the development process, and um, I guess I would also encourage people to reflect on like what's been successful for you in the past. Like, have there been newsletter updates before this one that have been more successful or got more clicks or views or something? You know, like what elements did those more or less successful posts or content have that like this one doesn't? Um, I think, yeah, it's like there's lots of elements here that you can think about that kind of all culminate to this. Yes, love to see a graph on legal topic areas and number of people served over the years, or where we get context from. yeah, if this is about a year in review, yeah, pull some fun facts, pull some statistics. People like people like numbers. Um, and yeah, there are certainly ways to, uh, yeah, like I said, present numbers and stats um, in like a visually interesting way. But yes, that is the only example I have. Uh, should I have had more examples? Maybe. But, just like overall, like thanks for listening. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, I am very down to answer.
I have a couple questions for you, if you have a moment.
Sure.
Um, kind of to go back to what was it that you mentioned? Kind of the patterns, like with the Instagram button changed, and you're going to click on this thing. I don't know if you're familiar with the game World of Warcraft, but they did a ton of user testing and psychology kind of testing when they were making that to figure out how to basically get people addicted to clicking on like a monster they had killed and opening up a treasure chest and things like that. So when you're talking about that, it really rang bells in my head. I'm wondering if you have any examples or maybe any ideas of how we can, I don't know, weaponize that for good instead of for corporate evil for once.
Yes, this is certainly something I think about a lot. We learn about addictive UI all the time. Like, it's literally how social media came to be. Um, yeah, it's tough, I think, because the time we spend on these platforms is directly correlated with profit. The longer that time that you can spend with something, the more chances that, you know, somebody has to get you in. But I think certainly just keeping these principles in mind, um, while you're not trying to like make your resources like addictive per se, I think there are like putting in that more critical thought of how you approach disseminating your information or presenting it, I think is not the best that we can do, but certainly a start. Um, but yeah, I'm not sure if I have like a super neat answer about how to not weaponize it for good. Yeah, it's certainly something that I think about a lot, but yeah. Any general tips I can give about colors, layout, etc. Um, I guess there are these things called park principles, I believe that they're called. Um, I want to say it's prox- uh, proximity alignment, something, and something else. I think it's like very kind of like basic notions of like patterns of the way that we see visual material and like why our eyes land on certain things first. Like you have a pattern of squares and there's a circle in the middle of it all. You're gonna see the circle first. Um, yeah, there's a whole like neuroscience design kind of thing that is a whole other world. Talked about having image descriptions for your graphics. Yes, very important. Accessibility, alt text. Um, yeah, a lot of social media platforms do offer alt text now, which is nice. But yes, being aware of color choice and spacing. I think like my rule of thumb is like more white space is better. Um, yeah, cramming everything into a page, if you can help it, is or space everything out if you can help it. Um, but yeah, color choice, color. I always have a hard time with color. Not that I'm like colorblind or anything, but yeah, there's a whole do's and don'ts, and the color is also very complicated. Yeah, I don't know if I have any like general tips without going like super into it. Um, would providing opportunities for clicks or participation, support, engagement, ask us anything. Providing
Do you mind
opportunities.
just reading the question out of the chat for the recording?
Right. Would providing opportunities for clicks / participation support engagement in the way Michael was asking, like an ask us anything Insta story, ask us anything about tenant rights on Tenant Rights Tuesday kind of thing? Yeah, I think, yeah, for sure. Social media is certainly a dynamic platform. Yeah, there are a lot more ways to engage with your audience and followers than just statically like putting out posts and say like you should go see this. Yeah, for sure, like polls, yeah, like ask us anything, like those question stickers on Instagram stories. um, I think a difficulty there is I think those specific tactics do require a more active or like daily social media presence, with uh, yeah, just those features because they only last for 24 hours. I think those do require a little more like care and consistency, which I know like not all organizations have the resources to do. Even me, like being mostly in charge of managing social media for QLaw, that's definitely an area I'm sure I could probably improve in. But yeah, also just like not wanting to be on my phone for my entire shift. So um, that could be huge, especially with having Facebook having stories. I know everyone wants to post their legal issues on Facebook. Yeah, Facebook stories are another Facebook stories. Facebook stories make me laugh, truthfully. I personally don't use them. The only people I know who use them are like the older people in my life. Granted, I think a lot of people in my generation don't use Facebook anymore. So, but you know, yeah, you can always post the same content in different places because the stories feature is the same everywhere. I think even Twitter has like a stories option now. So yeah. Do I have recommendations for a source for easily fillable, adaptable graphics for presenting numbers and information in not boring ways? No, not off the top of my head. I could probably find something. Um, Granted, I think data visualization / information presentation is always a little difficult because there's always that thing where like, oh, this statistic doesn't quite fit this graph, or you know, like I can't get this thing to do what I want it to do. Um, and so sometimes I, you know, have a bone to pick with fill in the blank or like put in your own um, kind of information stuff. But I can definitely do some digging if, yeah. Al says I hate it all. Yes, same. I think we all do.
So one other question, Kenji, I was thinking back to your presentation, beginning of it, where you were talking about engaging folks in the development of information and resources. And I'm wondering, you know, with QLaw Foundation, we've been doing a lot of community outreach and sort of creating relationships with community leaders that are sort of leaders in the communities that we are hoping to reach with our graphics and resources. And I'm wondering, you know, when in the corporate model of user-centered design, is what those folks do, like do they have people on staff that review and sort of test these types of interactions, or do they do focus groups? Or like, I'm just wondering for those of us that are in legal organizations where we're putting out a ton of resources, you know, I'm wondering how we kind of systematize the practice of engaging about the usability of our resources. Like, how do we systematize going about that information? I'm wondering if there's any clues there for from what other folks do.
Mhm. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing so I can stop talking to my full blue screen. Um, yes, I will say that there's a whole field called UX research, and it is people's literal job to figure out, do people like this button filled in or like, you know, colored blue or green, you know? It's like, but I think, you know, those practices do scale. But there are tons of usability testing methods. There are focus groups, you can do interviews, you can do um, surveys, you can do any number of different tasks. I think in part it depends on what the problem is or your like information space um, or like community that you're working with. Um, and it's like, yeah, it is kind of hard sometimes to talk about this in like such a broad sense because so much of it is really is contextual. And yeah, I don't always know if there's like a one size fits all answer, which I guess is the point of the whole process. But mm, as for yeah, how we can, uh, yeah, it's kind of tough. I think, at least for us in the context of our organization and the meetings we've been having, I think, you know, going back to the notes that we take during these meetings and being like, oh, like, you know, what came up a lot or um, what do you think was most like pressing to, you know, whoever we were talking to and like how might we address this in the resource that we're developing, um, I think is like a good start.
Thanks, Kenji. So we're almost at time. I know we have one more question from the chat, and then I'll invite folks that have any final questions. We'll just kind of do a, I guess, a last call for questions before we close.
Curious whether you see any bright spots in design moving past cis white male presumptions, particularly as the majority of internet users and many of the largest companies are now outside the white sphere. Websites, apps, schools of design. um, Bright spots. Yes. Can I think of them off the top of my head? Probably not. There's a ton of work out there about people trying to make um, strides past. Honestly, actually, I just read a paper for class last week about post-colonial human-computer interaction and like cross-cultural design. And actually, even in that paper, they critique participatory design, which, you know, I hailed in my presentation. Um, and so I think even like design is always changing. But yeah, I do wish I had more like tangible resources or like, you know, things to send people. Um, you know, as a student, school is kind of my whole life. And it's, yeah, I also have a bone to pick with the educational system and like why we learn the things that we learn and, you know, why our professors showing us these things and not others. And, you know, you can get into a whole rabbit hole there. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I do wish I had something more to give you. Yeah, I can definitely do some digging. Like, I'm sure there are many, many things out there. Yes, yes, I did. Yes, the first design presentation I've seen that has called out how so much is based on a cis white male standard. Yep, that is yeah, something I wrestle with every day of being a design practitioner. It's like, yeah, there are, and then you can get into the whole thing about how our mental models are also shaped by, white ideals and what we consider important and valuable, and like how we've come to internalize those things. Yeah, I will say it's just a lot more complicated than what I talked about today, and things really do expand way, way far outside anything I could cover in a 20-minute presentation. So,
Great. So it seems like we are about at time. I want to thank you all so much for coming, and thank Kenji. Thank you for sharing this information with us, your knowledge with us. I will say, as one of the lawyers in the room, this is not something that we were ever taught in law school. In fact, everything that we are taught about legal writing is to pack as much information as possible into our legal writing. And I think sometimes that's even to our detriment with judges, because judges are human beings who are trying to parse out information too. So this is just really super helpful for us to stay grounded in the folks that we want to be connecting with most. So for folks who have attended, we will circulate a recording and also circulate the slides if you would like them. And so if you have any other follow-up questions, you can email me at denise@qlawfoundation.org or email Kenji at intern@qlawfoundation.org. And we are grateful that you came. Thank you so much.